Hey, what's up, ethics class? Sorry I didn't record a video last week, but I think these three topics that we did the last 3 days all go together in a really interesting way and bring the issues that we've looked at in these theories to life in a very interesting way. So I hope you got some of that. I got some really cool questions and connections that some of you made in the forums that I want to talk about. But basically, what we're really looking at, I hope, is that we're getting deeper at understanding virtue ethics, Aristotle, the social contract, the sense of Hobbes and the agreements we make, the principle of utility and utilitarianism, the pleasure principle, maximizing pleasure, reducing pain, our sense of duty or obligation to act in certain ways, categorical imperative and Kant, and the newer idea of the ethics of care, which some people see as another version of virtue theory. These are the basic 5 theories that we looked at in the first part of the course, and now, as you have noticed, we are looking at how these theories are applied to, and there's kind of, we call these the big 3, but these are the big ones that are in most ethics textbooks because they are such hot button issues. The first one, obviously, is abortion, and the second one we looked at is euthanasia. Or physician-assisted suicide, and the last one is the death penalty. I wanted to put them side by side like this because there's actually some interesting correlations, I think, that happen that some of you are noticing, and if you didn't notice that, that gives us something to look at. The other thing, if there was one thread moving through what we looked at so far, I think was really interesting, well, it's the idea of quality of life. In the sense that a lot of these questions are going to be, they're going to touch on the big question about what is a quality life, or when we know, how able are we to assess quality of life, especially when we're looking into the future or when multiple people's lives are kind of at stake, as is the case in abortion. So we're going to start with abortion, then go to euthanasia and the death penalty, and I'll see how quickly we can get through some of these to see what you think. With the first one that I think really comes to light here is the sense of the social contract and how much we have the authority as a people to make laws that impact other people, i.e. like the difference, how different states have different laws regarding abortion and different countries have different laws regarding abortion. That casts a very interesting light on the social contract and raises a question of whether or not we have the right to make laws that impede on other people's sovereignty or their sense of autonomy. That's why Judith Thompson's article is so good, is she really raises the question, like, yes, the baby has a right to life, but that doesn't mean that it's entitled to the body of the mother, just as if I needed something to survive, if I needed you to come over to my house and lay your cool hand on my fevered brow to save my life, that would be great if you did that, but you're not required to do that just because I need it to survive. The same thing like with organ donors. So that was a really interesting question. Also, a lot of you brought up the ethics of care here. And not just for the unborn child, but for the mother itself. And so I know, when really thinking I love the question about whether or not you would agree or consent to have the unborn violinist attached to you for 9 months. And I know when I thought about whether or not I would be willing to do that, it really came down to how much support I would have. If I'm going to have other people helping me out, if I have the support to do the other things that I want to do, if I'm expected to not do any of those things. So this relates back to the social contract in a certain interesting way about whether or not we are giving people the care that they need in our society in order to make maybe the kind of decisions that they need to make. So I thought that was interesting. The other one that was brought up in the forum was the idea of utilitarianism and the principle of utility about whether or not bringing the baby to term is going to be net positive or not in terms of the pleasure and pain along those different levels of everyone concerned. And this totally reminded me of the discussion we have had about the Inuit in practice of infanticide, and how from the outside it seems very brutal and bad that they would let certain infants die, primarily female infants, but then we learn that those decisions are not taken lightly, and where that is practice, it's because the tribe is worried about the carrying capacity. So they basically don't bring the child full on into the world because they don't want it to starve to death when it gets older. So I feel like that's kind of an extreme example, but it does raise the very important question about whether or not we know whether or not we're actually going to make something better or not in terms of pleasure and pain. What's interesting is that we didn't get to talk about rights, but presumably we have a right to our body, but not a right to anybody else's. This gets picked up by a 20th century philosopher named John Rawls, R-A-W-L-S, if you want to look that up and use it or not. I think that's interesting. What I didn't see in this discussion forum was a question about virtue ethics. So a virtue ethicist would kind of approach this question differently and ask whether or not the decision we make, one way or another, is actually going to help us be a better person or not. So this puts a different kind of spin, and I think that's really, I want to bring that over here as well. And I did not see this point in the discussion forums. If you made this point and I missed it, one of the arguments against physician-assisted suicide is that it impedes in an individual's ability to practice virtue, or it takes away moments they have in their life that they could otherwise be working to develop certain traits. And obviously, if you are in uncontrollable pain that will not remit or not go away, and your quality of life is so bad, well, according to utilitarianism, that's easy, or at least it seems easy, that if we can reduce suffering, all other things being equal, we should. And that's a really popular view here, I feel like, and it was popular on the discussion forum. It's a less popular view, but an interesting and important one to consider, I think, that potentially when we're thinking about whether or not we should allow physician-assisted suicide, how much we build in or consider the virtue or the development, the moral development of all the parties involved, not just the person on their deathbed, but their family and other people that are interacting with. And this becomes really interesting, also connected with rights in the sense of how much we can make a decision for other people. So that brings us to the social contract. Here is about the conditions that we need to satisfy or meet in order to qualify for euthanasia. So in Oregon, for example, You have to, and in Colorado's new physician-assisted dying law, you have to meet a certain amount of conditions to show that your condition is not going to get better, to show that you're in severe pain or your quality of life is substantially impeded, and show that you have a right mind and that you're not being coerced to end your life early. And we might cash that out in different ways in different social contracts. And there's movements to revise Colorado's law to make it more comprehensive or put some more regulations on it to better match Oregon's law that has had physician-assisted suicide for longer. And then another really interesting question with ethics of care is what it means to care for people. Virginia Held identifies that there's two groups of people that we need to care for. First group being infants and young, and second group being our elders. I'm not sure as a society, I actually think American society does a very poor job of caring for our elders because of the economic demands we have to just make things work for ourselves. Interestingly, though, we live in a hyper-individualistic society where we don't traditionally, or we used to, 100 years ago, we lived in extended family units. That was the norm. So you would live with grandma and grandpa and uncle and aunt and mom and dad and children would all be in the same household. And that raises other different issues about whether or not we should allow euthanasia based on what would the most caring response be to the individual and everyone's involved. And the question I'm interested in as kind of an advocate of virtue ethics is what this means to the kinds of habits we can develop that will help us live good lives. So this connection, the connection to virtue ethics was not really in the reading, and I didn't really see it in the discussion forum, but it's still really interesting in this context. So I hope that we can see that, or at least begin to think about how that would be. The death penalty, again, we're going to look at the social contract, again, is going to be the conditions to meet or the type of crimes. There were some really interesting questions about what kinds of crimes would warrant the death penalty and what kinds would not. There's different places in different parts of the world that think differently about that, and whether or not we can come to an agreement, I'm not sure we can. The utilitarian argument we can look at in terms of the cost and the benefit to society, and just I could have written that in every one of these categories, because utilitarianism is a kind of cost-benefit analysis. What are going to be the negatives? What are going to be the positives? Can we outweigh them? I was surprised to learn when we looked into this in a previous semester that it actually costs more to execute someone on average than it does to keep them alive in a prison system for life, based on the cost of the appeals process and the cost of the courts. This seems wild to me. It also seems wild that we spend, on average, I can't remember, this figure could be wrong, but I want to say something about like $25,000 to $30,000 per year per inmate that we house in prison. It means we're spending enough money on each prisoner that it's enough to live on outside of prison. And this connects to the really interesting question about rehabilitation. There's a better word for this that I can't think of right now. Re-education. What we can do to kind of help somebody get better. And maybe it is rehabilitation. The question here is, at what point in time do we no longer want to help people? What crimes would they have had to commit for us to basically be like, no, we're done. We're not going to try to make you a better person. You're just done. And That's an interesting question for me, and I can see the argument that no one is that far gone unless they're literally cognitively insane. They're not. No one's that far gone. Um, but even then, even that sentence sounds bad. So I think that's a really interesting question that we didn't really get to, and the role of whether or not just as the death penalty as a deterrent or not, but whether or not we actually and should be doing something which connects to virtue to help not only the people that made the crime, but the rest of us that are participating in helping them be better people. I.e., how we treat our criminals and how we treat the worst of us may reflect on what kinds of moral characters we have, and also may interfere or add to our habits and how we approach the world. I'm always really stricken by the footage of, and there's a video I can in particular, but I can't remember who it was, of they were a wife of someone that was murdered, and they were like, I don't want to see. Justice to me is not seeing this person killed. Justice to me is seeing the murderer of my husband actually get better. We have compassion for him. I just think that's like remarkable. That's beyond the Good Samaritan. It's like the big ask. Well, I didn't see, and I want to make one other addition here. We have not put, and few people in the forum were able to put, Kant's sense of duty, or our categorical imperative, the things that we must do if we're going to be ethical. This fits. I wonder which one you would feel like it fits. Remember, there's two parts of Kant's categorical imperative, or the sense of duty that Kant has. One is that it's that golden rule on steroids. You act according to that law that you can will it become a universal law of nature, so that basically everybody would do what you would do naturally. So you basically treat other people like everyone wants to be treated, or you act in a way that you hope everyone would act. And the second one, as an extension of that, is that you just don't use people no matter what, because people aren't supposed to be used. And in a certain sense, we can see what's wrong about, or supposedly, if you're a Kantian, you could see euthanasia. If I'm using this to get something out of somebody, that's going to be bad. And if I'm using this for some kind of a reason, that's also going to be bad. Like if I'm just, anyway. The question here that is interesting is this idea of retributive justice. Retributive is like retribution. It means to pay back. And so retributive justice in the Kantian sense is that you get what you give. If you, and Kant is really clear about this, based on, so the categorical imperative is that you act according to that law, you can will it become a universal law of nature, right? If I murder somebody, I am basically saying I am okay living in a world where people murder other people. So what is the response that we should do if someone is a murderer? What should we do to deliver justice and retribution? Kant says that would mean that we would murder them because they've already conceded to live in that world. He also says the implication that people write about this is the punishment for rapists should be rape. The punishment for people that steal should be to get stolen from, which in a sense is some kind of rehabilitation. It's interesting. The other thing that makes this issue, the death penalty, not more interesting, but interesting in a different kind of way, is that it has to do with the justice system and our reading of Martin Luther King in the early part of the semester. So in a perfect justice system, we wouldn't need to worry about people being falsely accused. We also wouldn't need to worry about situations where people who have more money and privilege receive lesser sentences than people that do not have money or privilege, i.e., there's a sense that justice should be blind, so the scales of weighing right and wrong should actually be blind. Like, I shouldn't be able to see you and then deliver a sentence based on how you look. Or I should also be blind to the money that you have. So if you have more money, you shouldn't get a different kind of justice than someone that doesn't have money. But I mean, you see where I'm going with this, right? I mean, that's not the way our justice system is. People get discriminated against all the time, not only based on how they look, but also how much money they have in terms of what kind of a lawyer they can afford versus what kind of representation they can get within the system. And this is a really big deal in terms of there's a public defender crisis in America right now. Most people are taking plea bargain deals. They're basically just admitting their guilt, even if they're not guilty, just because they want to get through it. In any case, the death penalty, whether or not we use it, is implicated in some other really interesting social justice system issues. It's also interestingly connected with a lot of other social problems that we don't really have time to get into, but that's worth looking into if you're interested in it. Michelle Alexander is just the one name I'll give you if you want to look into this. She wrote and has great videos on YouTube for the new Jim Crow about how our justice system is really tilted and how it promotes this kind of inequity. So I just wanted to give this idea, one, to share how Kant's idea of retributive justice applies to the death penalty, in the sense that, you know, your punishment for doing something should have that thing be done to you, and also the reward of doing things well. Okay, I also just wanted to say a couple different things about what you could do with this chart or any one of these. If you are interested in writing about one of these topics or one of the ones that we are about to go into, you have one more essay due on our final day of class, which I believe is May 6th. It's on the syllabus. And you're going to choose what your position is on one of these issues and use some of the theory to help support your answer. So you could say, argue against euthanasia or argue for the death penalty, given certain theories that we've studied. So those of you that are doing that work already in your notes, that's awesome. I encourage you to do that. And I'd also encourage you to take care of yourselves. Dang, it's crazy out there. And I hope you're doing all right. I'm accepting late work in this unit and the rest of the semester. Ideally no more than a week, to save me some time of going back in there and figuring things out. But if you have extenuating circumstances, access issues, internet issues, just let me know. I trust you. I'm not really worried about you taking advantage of the situation. I'd just rather work with you. So let me know. I hope this was a good way of thinking about how these theories can be applied to these big three issues, and I'm looking forward for this week and the next in terms of income inequality and charity, and how much money we should be giving to people that don't have it, and perhaps under what conditions, which is really getting to be really big as coronavirus keeps on going. And I think arguments for universal basic income are coming or are getting louder. Also wanted to say it's interesting. I'm curious if any of you saw any tension in your own views here. If you have one view on abortion, does it really go with your view of euthanasia? And does it go with your view of the death penalty? Or do you think certain things applied to criminals don't apply to unborn fetuses, or don't apply to old people who are at the end of their life, or maybe not even old people, people who are at the end of their life and in a great deal of pain. How many of those questions come back to this one about the quality of life and what makes a life worth living? If Kant is right about that, if Aristotle's right about that, has something to do with the choices we're able to make and our ability to become and craft the characters that we are based on our habits. Okay, well, I hope this is beneficial. I'm imagining seeing some of you out there in my library office, but I'm trying to pretend like I'm in a classroom, so I hope if you watch this that you enjoyed being in class again. Okay, let me know if you have any questions. Bye.